we start?
I mean, I guess so.
Nice. Hi, everybody. My name is Parker Kay. Welcome to Pumice Raft. Pumice Raft has been at 348 Riding Avenue, where you find yourselves today, since 2019. Pumice Raft has been an incorporated non-for-profit since 2018. And since 2017, Pumice Raft has been exploring how placemaking practices permeate our lives and mark our landscapes. So as such, I'd like to acknowledge that for thousands of years, this land has been the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And I'm glad I have a nice score right now. To more specifically acknowledge these lands, I'd like to mention that if you follow Dundas further west, you'll encounter the great and powerful Humber River at Babby Point, which was the site of a former Seneca, Mohawk, and later Mississauga village called Te'iegon. According to the Bureau of American Ethnology, Te'iegon translates to "it crosses the stream." However, it's worth keeping in mind that there's a long history of colonial misinterpretation of indigenous place names. The village was a permanent settlement to around 5,000 people and was located along the Carrying Place Trail, an important trade route that led to the shores of Lake Ontario. Also, if you go a bit further east, the Davenport Bluff, that's the former shoreline of Lake Iroquois. So these lands are kind of steeped in history of the people who have been here for thousands of years. And so that brings us to today. I'm really excited for today's event. We're here to celebrate the Toronto launch of Fatine's amazing book, Kiss Landing. Yeah. Kiss Landing is a compilation of Fatine's work over the last 10 years of living and loving between Montreal and Casablanca. As you'll see through today's event, Fatine's work is a living record, a performance, and a celebration of her relationships with friends and family. So I thought it'd be exciting to include one of the people who's featured in the book and kind of exists between subject, collaborator, and most of all, friend. Which brings me to introduce our second guest, Nathan Donovan, who's a filmmaker who lives and works in Toronto. And although Pumice Raft is hosting tonight's event, I'm really here with the curiosity of a fan. I'm a big fan of both of Fatine and Nathan's work. So I'm kind of in the position of the audience where I'll be jumping in, kind of asking for more details, asking questions to both Fatine and Nathan, but really I'm excited to see two friends talk about long collaboration. A funny or an interesting anecdote maybe is that actually the first time I met Fatine and Nathan was in this space in 2021 when they both visited to see Garrett Lockhart's solo exhibition Relay. So in my mind, Nathan and Fatine are kind of linked already. So it's nice to see this play out in today's event. So without further ado, maybe let's just start really broadly. Fatine, maybe you could tell us a bit about how this project came to be, where you started, these things.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Parker, so much for hosting this very last minute. And I also want to say this whole contraption of the ways in which you're going to experience the images of the book tonight is Parker's entire idea and making. So very much collaborative installation here. So thank you so much for just being inspired by this in this way. And yes, so I guess maybe a bit of context is that I am a photographer. This book, Kiss Landing, is a collection of images shot between 2012 and 2022, so 10 years of work. And it's mostly images of family and friends and places between Montreal and Casablanca. I was born and I grew up in Casablanca. My father is Moroccan. I moved to Montreal when I was 8. My mother is Quebecoise. And I guess that's for those of you who don't know this, that's the main story. About how the book came to be, I guess it's just kind of the story of my relationship and discovery of photography from adolescence through late 20s, because it spans 10 years. I started taking photos in high school. Some of these images were taken maybe my last year of high school, like the earlier ones, and then all up until 2 years ago. And I always knew that I was collecting images and moments, and the more I was taking them across the years, the more it was clear that it was a practice of accumulation and of memory and tracing and archiving. I'd always had a journaling practice where I was writing in a diary, and to me photos were just the visual counterpart of that. So it was just something I was doing without any particular MO, until art school happened, and then it was clear this is what I was doing with my life, and I was understanding that these were serious images I was taking that were contributing to something I was building for myself. And to track my evolution, maybe, of my love for the medium. Is that enough for the moment? Yeah, okay, let's stop here.
Nice. I think something that's interesting to me is that when we first met, I didn't really know of you as a photographer. I think the first piece that I saw that you did was actually like a ceramic. And I've always thought of you as I'm familiar with your textile work. I remember early on in our friendship, we would have actually a discussion about typography. And I had asked you if you would ever make a custom font. And I remember you had immediately shut it down and be like, I would never make a typeface. I would only do it by hand. And that's one of my first memories of our friendship that I cherish. But you also have a radio show. And so with this in mind, I'm always thinking that with such a range of different mediums that you're working in, and you still do, even though photography is a focus here today, I wonder if you could speak to what it means to work between so many different mediums, and then in tandem, how does such a diverse practice sort of have conversation with your photography?
Yeah. The reason why I think because I was doing some photo in high school and then in Cégep, which is between high school and university in Quebec, I was doing photography as well. So that was really my focus. And I think I got a bit annoyed at how, you take 35 millimeter photos, so it's on film, but it's also the rest of the process at this point. The way I was interested in doing it was very digital, because I would digitize the negatives and then work on screen. And after having done 3 years of photo school where I was locked in a basement in front of screens, I wanted to do something, pursue my artistic explorations, but in a more tactile way and a hands-on way, and unfamiliar way as well. And this was always in the goal to bring this back to photography somehow, which I knew was the thing that was part of me the most. And so when you met me, I was at Concordia and I was studying studio arts, and I was doing everything but photography. Mm-hmm. So I was doing a mixed bag of ceramics, textiles, printmaking, video also at some point. Right, yeah. And I think when I look back, what I gather from the works I was making at that time and my interest in making them was always just the idea that it was a phase, and that I would remember this phase of my life because I happened to be taking ceramics back then. Or when I'm doing the radio show, it's so important to me. It's once a month, and it's always a question of these are the songs I'm into these days because I'm going through this, and this is a way of having a monthly checkpoint auditorily in an audio way that I can, it's creating clusters of nostalgia for myself maybe, that I'll listen back on certain albums or certain songs, and everyone does that. They remind you of a specific time in your life, and I just think everything that I've done was approached in that way of just like talking to an extremely personal experience, no matter what the medium is, in order to catalog that time of my life visually, auditorily. Is that a word in English? I don't know. In writing, yeah. Anyways, so I think maybe that's what links. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, I mean, it's more just curiosity about how many different things point, or how many different things can point in the same direction, I guess.
Mm.
I want to stick on nostalgia for a second, because nostalgia is kind of this like longing for what has already been. But when you're creating images with this kind of future nostalgia in mind, I don't know. I'm interested in hearing you talk more about that, like the planning for nostalgia rather than the indulging in nostalgia.
That's a very interesting question that I was not expecting.
It just came to me.
I think that I grew up obsessed with looking at family albums. And I also think that these were things that were unavailable unless, for example, I lived in Morocco and I would come to Montreal for the Christmas holidays, and that is the place where I could access certain photos. And I would go back, and every year I would look at them differently, because you're a child and you age so fast. I also think that I was growing up in Morocco, which is in Casablanca, very close to the neighborhood where my father grew up. And he never left Morocco to live elsewhere. He tried one time, he came back immediately. And we were living in my father's world my whole childhood. And his friends that he was talking about in his memories were still around. I think that when I moved to Montreal, suddenly I was in my mother's world. And we were in the city where she had grown up, where she had had many friends, where she was part of a nightlife, where she'd had many friends who actually passed away from HIV, and she was telling me all these stories as we were navigating the city together, and I had no faces to put to these people. I had no images of them, whereas with my father, the way he was talking about his childhood seemed like part of our present. I think this made me realize that I needed a support for the memories. I was also just really inspired by hearing my mother discuss of the mythology of the banalities of her past or something. And I just think that the photo album really represents that, and the family album. And ultimately, I believe this is what this is. I think maybe that's the idea. It's like about nostalgia, but it's also about having something to look back to track. I remember when we had the launch of this book in Montreal, I was talking with Dan, who's right here, and I would just remember the word proof was coming up a lot, like the proof that this happened, the proof that, the proof that. So I don't know, I feel like it's a quest for proofs somehow.
I'm wondering if you could, I guess it sort of relates to nostalgia in an abstract way, but I'm very curious, just because it's such a long project, 10 years, if you could speak about, and I know we have some images here, about some changes and differences in your practice between 2012 and then, we have that more recent image of, that portrait of Nabil.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to know, like, what are the differences between when you started shooting in 2012 and then kind of how you shoot now, I guess, in 2020.
Mm-hmm. Let me pull out that image. This is gonna be fun, I can tell. Should better catalog those. Where is it? I think it's here.
I'll find it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Jeez Louise. It's one of those Post-its.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I started shooting, I was so young, and it was about discovering the apparatus of film camera, and about like being fascinated at how colors were coming out on film. It was about discovering a medium, kind of, and the easiest way I had to access this new discovery of this medium was to photograph things that were really close to me. So my brother, my friends, my room, just very simple things that people photograph when they're young and whenever. And I think that as I photographed, as I kept photographing, especially photos of Morocco, I was realizing that I was trying to understand the ways in which I belonged, or I was trying to take photos of things that would help me when I'd come back here understand the way in which I live in that other context as well. I think that this image actually... oh yeah, and just for curiosity's sake, this is the oldest image in this book. One of these two, 2012. One of the oldest images. So this is my brother, and this is my father. And this is the last image I took for the book. I took this image of Nabil in December 2022, and this is 2 weeks before I left to go to Morocco for 4 months, for a period of 4 months. So I think here it's maybe interesting to do a bit of history. I don't want this to take too long, but I need to do it. But essentially, during the pandemic, I couldn't see my family. I couldn't travel to go to Morocco after years of just going back and forth very often. And it allowed me to do a bit of thinking and to realize that actually the only life I have when I go back is a familial life, and that I had no friends there, and that I was pretty dissatisfied by that, and it was really a big obstacle in understanding the ways in which I belonged when I went there, and it made it very hard for me to reconcile these two aspects. And I was realizing that I was living two extremely compartmentalized lives, and that was going to become increasingly complicated to reckon with, and that I also no longer wanted that. I was just thinking of how I would introduce friends to family, and it all felt extremely stressful, and I decided that I no longer wanted to do that. And a year and a half later, I went back to Morocco, and I just decided that I was going to go to Marrakesh, which is not where my family lives, and that I was going to go and find parties and make friends, very nerdy endeavors. And I did that, and what I found out is that there were many people there with who I could share similarities and friendships and all of that. And from that point on, I realized my rapport to even the way I photograph was going to change. Because I no longer wanted to photograph things that I was observing and felt like I had trouble accessing. Like I would always think of the fact that the things I was photographing, when you show them here, people react a certain way, but if I were to show them to family there, they would think it's the most banal thing. They wouldn't understand why it's interesting. And that seemed really alienating to me, to think that a Moroccan public or auditory, I just didn't understand how to like connect more with that audience. Anyways, long story short, this image is the understanding of a lot of things for me. It was taken in June 2022. And at that point, I had gone to Morocco and again was going to Marrakesh to try and live an autonomous life, because in Casablanca, where my family's from, I can't do that because of a lot of family things, because I am my father's daughter and I'm not an adult in their eyes, essentially. And when I went to Marrakesh, I booked an Airbnb, and I booked it because it looked like something that was extremely shocking to me. The photos of it online I thought were ridiculous, because no one actually lives like this. It's a very Orientalist dream and interpretation of what a household is like, and it's also completely, it's just untrue. And I felt myself being really attracted to this idea of like a place that is owned by a Moroccan in order to make money and, you know, live through Airbnb, but that is self-orientalizing in a way. And I started thinking that I wanted to take a photo of this room. And when I got there, I realized that I was really worried about the fact that I might be doing that in my own work. And the ways in which I was photographing Morocco, I was worried about if they were from a touristic point of view or something like this. And I was just realizing that I was asking myself different questions. And I decided to go to Morocco for 4 months. And so anyways, this photo was taken a few weeks before I went there for 4 months. And I knew that after this, my rapport to the place would change. And I knew this would be the last photo taken for this book and that I was going to move on. Anyways.
You mentioned that the approach, like the photographic approach between Casablanca and Montreal was different. That really struck me while going through the book. You know, the Moroccan images, there's a distance to them. You know, it's there's more architecture, there's more space. There's also a kind of more of a voyeuristic quality, like you are more removed from the scene than in the Montreal images. You're often like an active participant along with your subjects. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think it's weird to talk about too, but because it's just really personal and has to do with literally me. But I don't really look Moroccan. When I go there, it's shockingly like obvious that I'm mixed or just that I don't live there. They clock you immediately, and it's just kind of an overall felt for a long time like a very embarrassing experience that no one really could relate to, being Moroccan and being in a place and feeling like you're not from there. And I think that I think I was hiding a lot when I was taking photos of Morocco. Before I try less. The indoor shots in Morocco are different. They're like with family and they're much more intimate and much more close, I think. But every time I'm outside of the domestic sphere, it's true. It's very removed. It's, I think it just speaks to that. It speaks to this quest of trying to understand without wanting to intrude. It's like a discomfort really is what you're seeing, I think. And really not knowing how to be myself without being like, obviously noticed, I think. Yeah,
I actually wanted to speak on that also, more kind of just like with the structure of the book, and like also maybe I'm thinking of this just as like a personal detail through you, and just like thinking of like splitting and dyads, and like just like I know your parents are divorced. And I think I was just thinking like through the book, if you could speak about like sequencing and pacing and stuff like that, because oftentimes it's 2 images split over 2 pages. And I'd wonder if you could speak about that, how you sort of took on the infrastructure of the book, I guess, if you had that in mind, this idea of splitting and like, it is Montreal, Casablanca, like, and there's, all these different iterations of like a binary.
Actually, that's one of the first questions I had to ask myself when I started making the book, because the first step was the image selection and just parsing through all of that and seeing. Yeah, and speaking of which, we have like a few images that didn't make it into the book. If you'd like that kind of. This image didn't make it. Regret not putting it in there. I hate this one. Nathan wanted to show it. Regret not putting this in there. Didn't notice it until yesterday, actually, when Nathan pointed it out.
I noticed it.
Yeah, that's my dad when he was young.
Yeah, can you tell them what you told me about the wall and stuff?
Yeah. Wait, what did I tell you about the wall?
You told me that. Yeah, it's you didn't want people to latch onto it being.
No, exactly. I think that because at the time I took it because I thought it was romantic that the wall is decrepit and it's falling, because this is what my father's apartment looked like. And when I was making the book, I think I was trying to be a bit more critical about my own self-orientalization of things and the romance in the decrepit and the way I look at Arabness from this Western perspective. I was trying to be a bit more like hard on myself or something. And I was like, is this pretty because I'm looking at it in this way? Or is this pretty because this composition looks good, which I think it is good. And I regret not putting it. I think I was overthinking it. It's hard. Don't be mixed. I don't recommend it. Like self-policing, like constantly. Anyways, this is my brother. He looks cool. I really regret not putting that one in there, because this is the stripes and the flower, 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 flower. You can't really see it too well, but yeah. And then you like the pants and you like this.
This is a beautiful image and a beautiful man.
I mean, yeah. He's single and 25.
How often do you find yourself kind of battling between like the aesthetic arrangement of an image versus the moment that you find yourself in? You know, like the being in the moment versus kind of constructing it from the outside.
Can we put a pin in that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm realizing I didn't answer Nathan's initial question of the splitting.
Oh yeah.
And I'm so sorry. But just initially, I think the sequencing was the first thing I had to think of when it came to the book. And I think this is actually a great example to speak of what I'm going to speak on, because my graphic designer is also Moroccan. He lives in Paris. And it was great to work with another Moroccan person who lives outside of Morocco on this, because it was a lot of talk about negotiating. How do you not make it cheesy in terms of the contrast between and while also just drawing these parallels that are pretty poetic and romantic and do speak to the situation of being split. So a lot of decisions had to do with, is this too obvious? Is this too annoying? Is this irritating, or is this like narrative? Does this work in that way? This is one that we had a hard time with, like, because I thought formally it worked. You know, there's like these two kaftans, and then there's these, you know, two figures.
I think the garments are really like at the forefront in both those images.
Exactly, but then there's also like, could not be more opposite. It's like wooden Canadian shack, and then obviously this like interior, you know, this oriental interior. So it's hard, but it was worth it for us to move forward with that one. You know, it like worked formally, so that was cool. But that split is always like a negotiation between like, are you using this to like say something, or are you using this because it flows nicely? I
can actually also add to that too, because like I know, I actually forgot to mention that like something we wanted to discuss is that Fatine in her undergrad did film studies, and I think Parker was sort of this idea of contemplating between sort of planned and unplanned, and you know, a lot of your images like have this like staged element to it, like that one that you showed in Joyce, for example, with your dad and the bread. So yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about one, your relationship to cinema and how that comes out through the photography, and on the other hand, if you could speak on the differences, or maybe just generally about what the sort of planning is for staging an image versus like something that would be like more documentarian, and like even like how you would approach those things, or how do you conceive of those as like different works?
Mm-hmm. It's a hard question to answer, because I think that the photos that are the most staged, I'm using this as an example, they involve people that you ask to do something, and so it's like that's as staged as it gets. But at the same time,
a little bit like that.
That's not staged, baby. It's just a.
What about this?
That's my slight OCD in the way I put my hair clips on the board. This is not staged, but it might look like it.
Yeah, it's like, I think one would assume that you're like making adjustments and stuff. So that's what I was curious.
Yeah, I guess the frame, that's the control thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think these are two things which are interesting to contrast, because I think this is like the way you control, and this maybe speaks to what you were saying, the way you like frame things and like control things, or the way things happen spontaneously and you walk in and this is what's, you know, and it's hard. I would say it's like, yeah, how much do you want to tweak something to like serve you, and how much do you want to just like capture what is? I think it's with objects, it's easier to like accept that you can tweak things and like move them around, I guess. With people, the stagedness is also an interesting word, or it's like, yeah, that's a good example. I think it's, in the case of these two images, it's interesting because I think that the staged nature of them actually serves to represent something that's very real, and that is the opposite of staged.
Yeah.
These are friends, this is their relationship, let's like, you know, we're already here in this room hanging out, and we're playing together, because this is also the way that I relate to a lot of people, is like taking photos of them, and that becomes a part of the relationship, and not the other way around. Like the relationship isn't there to serve the work. The photo just happens to be part of the way we play. In this image, this is also important to mention, but I think a big reason why I had this moment of I want to be an adult and find my place in Morocco and like start living autonomously is because after COVID and going back to Morocco, my father had a lot of health issues and couldn't drive anymore, lost all his autonomy, and I was understanding that if I didn't start accepting this and changing my outlook on Morocco, as of now, it was going to happen in a shocking way that, you know, these things happen. And that was also like part of why I like realized this book and the way I was like photographing for 10 years was probably going to change as well. And this image was while he was at his lowest, like pretty sick, and this is also really staged, but it's also a way of doing something together in the house while he has very limited mobility. This one and the bread image, actually, do we have it printed out, or is it in the book?
I'll find it.
It's earlier in the book, I think. But these two images are actually like, yeah, were taken in the last year that I was shooting for the book. I was realizing that things were a bit more staged. Because it was a new way to access a reality or to want to enter in contact with people.
It's not marked. This one's also good though, I think.
Yeah, these are not staged either. This is just taken candidly in the moment, and this is I'm happening to see a thing where you are, and I ask you to stop and look up, and you understand when you see me that I'm going to take a photo of you, so you collaborate. And it's that's the thing. It's also like similar to this, and a lot of photos of Gérald in our later years together are just this response. It's like, you know me, we have this relationship, you know I take photos, you see me with my camera, you respond to me, you do a thing, I don't know what you're gonna do, this is what they did, and I took a photo of it, and it's like, it becomes this dialogue, and it's part of this relationship, it's part of the way we play and relate. So this is why the word stage is interesting, because this looks maybe staged, maybe it doesn't. It is, but it's also not.
Yeah, it's just like the energy changes when you bring a camera into the
exactly
conversation.
And I think also, we were talking about this morning, but I think like the way I've been photographing changed as it became understood by the people around me that I was doing this more and more seriously, because it's like they want a photo of them that I would be taking, because it inscribes itself in a longer lineage of the way in which we relate through my photographs. It becomes part of this relationship that we have, and people like Gérald or Connor that I've photographed for years, there's like many iterations of portraits of them. This is the first year we met, and then this is maybe like, not gonna cry this time, damn. A few years, and I feel like there's already a bit, it's subtle, but I see it. There's more engagement, there's more play, there's more like challenge in their gaze towards me. This is more like calm, we don't know each other that well. And then it becomes like, you know, full trust. I don't know. That's really, I feel really blessed that I can have like relationships like that through my work, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think it's like, that's such an impressive part of your work to me. It's just that there is no element of like reserve, really. Everyone is very comfortable, and I think that's incredibly difficult to achieve. And it's just something I enjoy so much about looking at your images.
Yeah, one of the first things that struck me about your work was how your friends were willing to perform for you. And then what I kind of, as I got to know you better, I realized that it's because you're fostering that type of relationship with the people in your life. And that your relationships are so much a part of the realization of your work, which I think is maybe a nice way to segue into talking about your relationship with Nathan. Because what's interesting is that you both have taken turns kind of being subject in each other's work. And I'm curious just about, collaboration, friendship, history, nostalgia. How do these things play out in terms of the way you guys have collaborated over the years?
I also just want to say that Nathan made his first short film in the fall, and I was in it. Just for context.
The star of it.
No, but just people need to know. No, not about me, just to understand.
Yeah, you were in it. You were the star. Shut up. I think you should answer first because I was photographed first and the film came later.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. I'm just curious about how the dynamic changes, whether it's collaboration, whether it's co-creating, or just hanging out as friends. How is it different when Nathan is behind the lens of your camera versus you, or I guess in front of the lens of your camera versus you in front of his?
I can't tell because I started photographing Nathan the first year we were friends. And this film was shot in the fall of last year, so 5 years later. So for me, when I arrived in front of the lens for you, it was already like full trust.
Yeah.
We already had like such a deep relationship. Like it's hard to tell. For me, I mean, I told you I watched Nathan's film like a few nights ago. I hadn't seen it yet, and when I had read the script, I didn't really know. Honestly, like how it was gonna pan out as a movie. I was like, sure, but I also knew that he asked me to do it because it's part of our relationship, the way that, we're interested in like showing each other or like we're interested in the trueness of each other. And there was no doubt for me that I wanted to do that for you. And I don't know, how do you feel about being photographed by me? Or I don't know, how do we want to answer this prompt?
Well, I was going to say that I feel like there's like similarities between our work in terms of like comfort and also document, archive. I think that's something that I'm doing with film also, of just being like, this is about people I care and trust. Like that is such an important part to me. Like, and a part of that is also just being direct. Like things come easier and things are understood without so much exposition. Like I know Fatine knows what I'm about and knows what I guess like needs to be done, and there's that trust. So like things like more natural things unfold when you don't have to talk so much about like what's trying to be accomplished. And I feel like that is kind of the same thing with the photo, where it's like I don't even have a particular feeling about it because it's just like I know you're doing your thing and you're doing it for your reason, and I'm happy to be there. And that's like my thought is kind of doesn't go beyond that, being like, this is just great. I want you to do what you want to do. I'm happy to be here. It's not like it's like kind of, it's just natural. It's just part of like being, an artist, and there's not these like clear divides between your quote unquote like lived experience and your art. Like,
It's also like, because we live in different cities, I guess it's also just like, well, this is yet another way we have to spend time together. It's just like enriching the relationship or something. Yeah.
Yes, I had a question that we have talked about a lot, and this is such a huge part of the book, just about intimacy. And I think I'm curious about the title of the book, which I mean, you can explain, it's like an aviation term
Yeah.
generally, but also, kiss landing could be, this kind of evocative, vague statement, and people obviously have their ideas about kisses landing and what that could mean. But I think a lot of your images go outside the traditional definition of intimacy and how that exists and how that's cultivated. So I was curious if you could tell us, what, you think about intimacy and how that comes through in the photography.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also tell us about the title.
Yeah, okay, let's start with that. The title. So, more context. My father, for 35 years of his life, worked at the airport in Casablanca, and he was at the travel and lodging counter, which is essentially a job that doesn't exist anymore with the internet. But he was in charge of welcoming people, tourists, voyagers who were arriving into the country and directing them towards hotels or helping them transit into the city from the airport. And so the whole job was a hospitality job, really. But it also meant that he knew a lot about aviation, just as from spending so much time in the airport. And he would always ask me, how was the landing when I would arrive? Still does. How did it land? Did people clap? All of that. And he knew about a few aviation terms. And one of the terms, when I would say, like, it was very smooth, like barely felt anything. And he'd be like, oh, kiss landing. And that's a term that people use in aviation pilots to describe a landing when the plane, I mean, you guessed it, just like very like gently lands. And the interesting thing about it, actually, that my dad told me, is that it's actually not ideal for the aircraft because it burns off all the rubber from the wheels because it has to make contact for a longer period of time. And that just was, I don't know, it just felt very true. This way of like, when you arrive somewhere, it means that you've left somewhere else. I mean, for me and these two cities, that's a pretty profound way of arriving somewhere or leaving somewhere else. It just comes hand in hand with two places that I feel really at home in, as conflicting as that relationship can be.
Yeah, I think it's like perfect actually, because like the airplane just is such a big part of your family.
It's kind of weird, actually, that it's like I just spent so much time in airplanes and in the airport just hanging out with my dad, or some days going with him, and it's such a pivotal way that my life is about planes, kind of, and my dad's job is about it. It's interesting. And my mom is a woman of letters. She's like a literature teacher, so it's about language. It's like, I don't know, it just makes so much sense that it would be a poetic title about planes. But also something about the title, which I only realized because when you asked me this question, and we were talking about what you wanted to know about, I realized how contradictory these two words are, because a kiss is such a fleeting thing. It's like an instant, it's a moment, and it can be really meaningful, really ambiguous. It's just ambiguous. It's and you never get enough of it, or maybe sometimes you do, but landing just has such a different connotation in terms of being grounded, like being like, it's kind of the opposite of a kiss in a way. Ultimately, like, that's not something I was thinking of before you asked, honestly, but I do think it takes on a whole other meaning, more poetically, in that way.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, could you speak to the intimacy of like family versus friends versus, I guess mostly that, but like these objects, there's like stuffed animals in your book. So
yeah, I think they all represent each other in a way. Thank you. And I think that is particularly where it starts becoming really interesting to do sequencing in the book, is when you realize that it just like photos take on a new meaning. For example, this object wasn't my dad's car. It's just this little keychain thing, and my dad would always refer to it as Nathan, who's my brother. He's like, oh, that's her brother. That's her brother. You know, it's just in the car with him all the time. And I don't know. It's like it's a funny thing, and it's a weird photo ultimately, and it's a bit eerie on its own. And maybe this is just for me to know, but it arrives in the book, and this is where the intimacy comes in. But this whole sequence, which is about my brother and my brother growing up. And this is the first image of the book, you know, the oldest image maybe, taken in Morocco. And then it evolves into a newer image of him being really upset about this haircut. And then it evolves into this symbol of him, which relates formally to shadows of a scene in Montreal that have nothing to do with my brother. But, you know, this is how you construct the labor of love, of the poetics of looking at your work and understanding that these things can have meaning. And you land back again. This is also 2012. This is also one of the oldest images in there. And it's him again. And this is my mom. And then it's him again a few years later. I don't know if that answers, but there's also a few images of this plush toy.
Yes, this.
Which I photographed a lot. It's my oldest toy that I had when I was a child. And I always title it Self-Portrait. But what was the question?
Well, there's that image that Parker, one of his favorites, I think that's just a great example of that.
You gotta get organized. We talked about this.
Oh, it's just fine.
Talked about this. Oh, yeah.
Like just talking about all these different people, which is to me is just a very intimate photo, but it's not a family, it's a group of friends, but it's like there's just such a great sense of closeness.
Yeah, I think that's like outside the work, almost. It's like this could be a phone photo or something. It's just,
right.
You know what I mean? It's like, it becomes part of my work because I've created an apparatus for myself where I archive everything, and therefore everything I'm archiving can find its place in the book. And this is what's great about it, I guess. It's that it's just all about the intimacy I share with these people. And whether it's like very obviously, you know, like very aware or more like subtle. I don't know. There's also all these ways in which things are intimate, even in non-portraits. I mean, I talked about the spread when we had the launch in Montreal, and I just think about it a lot because initially this was a very formal pairing because of the blue, because of the light, because of the V, the angles. But I feel funny repeating things I said to you in the Montreal reading, but the Montreal launch. But this is my apartment I grew up in Casablanca that I go back and visit when I'm there from time to time. And I just go in and I walk around and I look at it. And these were taken in 2013, I believe, during one of my pilgrimages. And what's shocking to me about this is that it's really about the light and the fact that the light in there is the same light from when I was a kid. Not only is the apartment still there, but like the visceral way in which I experience walking through it is the same. And that's really psychoanalytical when I think of the fact that I paired it with an image of my mom, who's a reliable figure that is viscerally something I understand and like feel on a really unconscious level. I think that the ways in which my work is intimate, I'm still finding out about as I look through the book again, as I think about the ways in which I'm going to talk about the work with you today or like with Dan a month ago. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
I want to go back to cinema.
Hell yeah.
I don't know if we mentioned, but you did a minor in cinema studies.
I want to turn that into a major.
But I think there's so many equivalencies between the form of the book and the film, right? Like even throughout the conversation, like the idea of sequencing is kind of interchangeable with the notion of pacing, which is much more of a filmic term. The jump cut, like page to page, the contrast between images, the way you would contrast between the edit of a film. I'm curious, what is your relationship to the cinematic nature of your work? How do you see this as kind of a stills of an unfolding narrative?
Yeah, I guess this is a very long-winded way of making a movie. The book. No, but initially, when I was in photo school, I wanted to go to university and study film production and make movies because I wanted to still want to be, a music video director. And ultimately, I do believe that my final form is as a filmmaker. I'm saying this now. Maybe I'm jinxing it. I don't know. But I just know that this is, to me, cinema is the highest form of art. I'm just going to say that. Everything else is like not as exciting. That's a really crazy statement to make. But don't hold me to that. I never said that. I think the thing about cinema, the reason that I was deterred from it, and ultimately the reason why I wasn't ready for it, but I need to build up this way of approaching it, is because I'm obsessed with control. And I realized if you go to study cinema and you make movies, you need to work with 1 million people and you go extremely slow. And I think I'm trying to undo this in myself, but you know the idiom, go far with many people and go fast alone. I wanted to go fast. 10 years of work, that's not fast, but I think that it was more satisfying to me to just focus on photography. And I do think that my rapport to the way I compose images has changed in the way of getting me closer to a cinematic approach. I think at the beginning I was taking portraits, so many portraits all the time. And I was really thinking about myself as a portraitist. I take portraits, this is what I do. And at some point, I became very frustrated with the idea that sometimes what you see is not what you can capture. And I hate to get technical, but I started shooting initially with a 35 millimeter camera, but with a 50 millimeter lens, which means that you're always a bit zoomed in, you're a bit closer to your subject when you look into the camera. And I was fantasizing about having an embedded film camera behind my eyes that I could just blink and it would take a photo of what I would see. And it took me a few years to figure out the fact that I could literally research what is the closest focal length to human vision and find out that it was a 35 millimeter lens and that I could purchase that with a grant from Concordia University, thank you. And that I could completely change my image making. And that was in 2018. And I think that from making portraits or landscapes, I started making. Where's the photo of my uncle in the chicken plate? Oh. I started making. Is it in here?
It's in the state.
Scenes. And that just became really important to me. And I think that became a way for me to remember, cinema, that's actually what I want to do. And I started being, since then, I've honestly only, even though I switch between lenses, but I mostly shoot horizontals now. And I mostly shoot scenes, much less portraits. But sequencing a book is also really like editing. I mean, I think I've showed a few examples in here, but I guess it really scratches that itch to be able to sequence a book like that. But I think eventually I'll get to cinema. Just give me a second.
I think the last thing that I was thinking about was just being here and this sort of thing, and then also thinking about your work, which is, or sort of speaks to the first question also about how we were talking about, you were doing ceramics and textiles and you had this multimedia approach. I think I'm also curious, you have this book, you have hang prints in a gallery, you do art fairs, and okay, we're doing this talk now, you're talking about doing cinema. you've done magazines, you work as a freelancer, so you're for hire photographer for other people. You have a lot of collaborators. I'm wondering, that's a lot of different things. Can you speak about how the images are different between those roles you take and sort of what it means to like produce for a book versus for hanging a print on the wall? And then, we brought that other magazine you did. Mm-hmm. So we should look at that too, because it's quite interesting to just see the difference between personal work and like freelance stuff in that way.
I mean, I think first off, this is a big question. I think I want to show this, which is a photo that is in the book, but this is a good example of like, so initially I was taking photos of all this stuff, and I also thought I had this like art practice based in like textile and like whatever that wasn't photography, and that was something that belonged in the art world, and that my photo was something that belonged in books. And to me, it was like a separate thing. And then in 2021, I got asked to do this show at Joe Project in Montreal, and someone was interested in showing my photos, just my photos, simply, and had already a selection of images, Jackson Slattery. And I was shocked, and I was also like, yeah, we need that, because I don't know that there's any photo shows in Montreal or anything. People, other than like retrospectives of artists, it was just something I wasn't seeing, and I thought it was a very brave endeavor that Jackson wanted to do. And I was also, it kind of planted this idea in my head that I could do something else with my photos and just print them for zines or books and things like that. And the year after, Dan here asked me to do this show at Joy's, and I was like, okay, good opportunity to show photos. How do you show photos in this way that is interesting? And because you can show photos in a book, you can show photos on your phone, you can show photos online. There's many ways, and I think it became a little like game of in which ways can you extend this generosity, or like how do you make it worth people's time to go to a gallery to see things they could order online as part of a book or look at on, every show documentation is a photograph, no matter what the medium is. So I was just interested in the challenge of giving a little bit more of, not that I think today I'm okay with showing just a photo, but I think, that was initially the way I was approaching it. So this image, which is also in the book, just is of a bread garland that then becomes actual bread hanging in the gallery. I don't know, this is one way in which I approached gallery work. And then working with Eli, for example, Eli Kerr, who I just remember when we went to the art fair in Marseille, and it was interesting because he wanted my input on how we were going to hang the booth, and it was some of my works, sure, but it was also works from Alan and Anthony Brenham, and that was interesting because then it became about thinking of the ways in which you're going to read something, you're going to read a booth, and it becomes this almost this like graphic designer work of space. And that's interesting because it just related to, for me, what the work I was doing with my towels. I was like hand painting these towels at Concordia, and it's like a similar way. It's like, how are you going to read something on the walls, on this artwork, like with calligraphy? I don't know, to me it was all really related. I don't even know what we're talking about right now.
Well, you could speak about how
segue?
You approach this kind of stuff differently.
Yeah,
or
collaboration.
if there is a different approach.
I think ultimately I'm obsessed with reading, because like the way I hang works in shows, it's like I'm reading, and then the book, it's like you're reading it, and even this with Shahan. So Shahan is my roommate, studio mate, collaborator, friend, therapist. So he has a fashion background. I mean, he works in fashion. He's a fashion archivist, and we get to work on commissions together, which is very interesting because there's a whole prompt and there's a goal and we need to achieve specific things. There's like things we need to show in a certain way. It's like commercial, but then it's also not because we're being trusted by people who know we're not interested in commercial things. So it's much more free in a way. But
yeah, there's this rigid element from the outside in which like you must show a certain thing.
Yeah. I think it's all about legibility ultimately in that way as well. Like the way you like read a booth, read a gallery, look at the book, like the way you understand something is coming through, the way you're going to make it come through. And I think ultimately I was interested in showing this work for a completely different reason that relates a bit to the book and to this notion of intimacy. But it's that in the collaborations we've done with Shahan, they require a lot of like outside help and people who just want to be involved, such as this, which is we created a fake runway show. And we just asked people to dress in a specific way and bring specific accessories. And it's interesting because we have all these things we want to have. Like, for example, we want to have some people holding cameras in the crowd. We want to have a sparkler. We want to have at some point someone pulling the garment. We want to have like, oh, this person's wearing an interesting sneaker, has an interesting bag. We need to showcase that. We also want cameos of everyone who's working. Like Carol's a makeup artist. She needs a cameo. I need a cameo at some point. We have all these. We have a crazy list. Shahan's cameo, a dog, someone with a rose in their mouth. It's like, yeah, I don't know. We have all these things we're trying to do, and it becomes really crazy planning. And then the day of, when everyone shows up, we kind of realize that what dictates the work is simply the people who are there and who are willing to participate, and that becomes the most important thing. Like the day of this shoot, we did another similar shoot, but all the priorities became about everyone who's there. We need a photo where we see them clearly. And it's just, I don't know, I just think that that is what ends up dictating the work I do, I guess, is just the people who want to be there. I will end the sentence.
I love this work so much. It's one of the first things I maybe saw of your work like before I really knew you, but I bought one of them. And what I like about it so much is that you've rendered a crowd, which is this kind of like anonymous group of people, but they're all your close friends. And to me, what I love about these images is that you've provided the opportunity for an illusion to happen. You know, like the one thing I really like about theatricality or the idea of the mask is that, you know, you could think of the mask as like a opportunity for concealment, but it's also maybe an opportunity to express yourself in a way that you wouldn't otherwise feel comfortable. And I feel like your work often creates the situations for that kind of like reality to occur through illusion.
Yeah, and like suggestive playing, like trying to suggest people like play with you.
I mean, I don't even know how to follow that up. It's like very touching to hear that. It's nice. It's nice to know that because I think ultimately, especially in this kind of fashion work, especially with someone like Shahan and his personality, and again, like it's just like Nathan, it's like a close friend that I work with, and I think that just speaks to our shared aspirations as human beings. So cheesy. Before like even the work we want to produce and the way we want to be perceived and the art we want to make and what we want to inscribe ourselves in, it's just like, what do we yearn for? Yeah. Damn. Yeah.
We've been talking for about an hour.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
Maybe we could open it up to audience questions.
Not too hard, please.
Who wants to jump in?
Hello.
Hi, Dan.
It's so weird.
Is it?
That was a great talk.
Thank you.
I was thinking, like, you are just so good at being vulnerable. Like, you just make it look really easy. So thank you for
Wow.
sharing. One thing you kind of covered, like your thought process about it in the book, but it occurred to me when we did the talk in Montreal. You spoke a bit more about self-portraiture and your like relationship to yourself and how you wanted to feature that in the book. But this time around, I was thinking a lot about your brother and his experience and how you've shared so much of the same experience of going back and forth. And my question is sort of how do you approach him as a subject? Or since you've already spoken a bit about how he's represented in the book, do you want to speak more about the self-portraits?
Huh. It's, I guess, yeah, it's interesting because he's my, it's interest. Actually, let me talk about that. No, because he's my little brother, therefore I bully him. No, but what I mean is like, I don't know, like taking photos of him is, it's part of our relationship, but he's also, this is funny, but he's also a natural model at times. And I think it's even more profound to be able to take photos of him because he really hates it. Because I think that he's like very, like, I don't know, I guess he's viewed in this way of being photographable. And it's hard to, I don't know, it's similar, maybe it's similar to the relationship of like wanting to take a photo and then wondering about like, you know, is this like an Orientalist perspective on a scene I want to capture? Like, is this someone I want to capture because he's a beautiful person, and then he maybe wonders why I want to take a photo of him, or maybe he doesn't want to be taking a photo, you know, like it is very special to be able to photograph him, maybe sometimes more than some close friends, I would say. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think he has a relationship to being photographed that no one I really know has. So that's interesting. And also he lets me take photos of him, but he always pretends he doesn't want to. He's always like, okay. And then he's ultimately happy. And I don't know, it was interesting talking about the book with him too, because he sees himself age. And also because this is like, again, like personal life stuff, but my brother and I were separated for a while. Like for a while he lived with my father in Morocco and I lived with my mother in Montreal. And I think, I don't know, I just think it's, oh God, I can't answer this. For a long time I was reuniting with my brother when I was seeing him. I wasn't just like daily with him. It was always a reunion and I knew I would leave him. And I think that's why it's like really special to be able to take these photos of him. Some photos in this book were taken when we were apart. And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
So beautiful, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm also a fan.
Hi.
Hi.
I'll give you a second to just
No, I'm
recompose.
good. Yeah, whatever.
I guess just something I'm taking from like looking at the images here, like specifically you have like ones that didn't even make the book. Like it seems like you probably have an enormous amount of images. Like this looks like a big book, but also to hear that it's 10 years worth of images, like I'm sure it would have been difficult to pare it down. So I just wondered if you could speak maybe to that process, and like also like maybe working specifically with this designer. Was it something where you just had a huge pool and brought it to them and then you worked together on, you know, narrowing it down?
Yeah, I had 800 images, and this is not even all of the images I ever had, but like, you know, that I was like, okay. And then I said I need to clean up. So I then had 500 images, and those are the images that me and the designer looked at. And then in the book there is, in the end, 200 images. So it was a lot of parsing through. And ultimately, also, I think I accidentally was parsing through images in the last 2 years I was shooting them, because I think at some point it became about shooting things that I didn't have already. like, oh, I already have this kind of portrait of someone. Let me get something new that I don't really have. And it became this like different kind of strategy. Maybe this is when my images started being a bit more staged as well. Which is also a reason why I think I felt like, oh, this is coming to an end. We need to make a book. Like I'm getting a bit too like aware of my own ways. Yeah. So that is a thing. But then I think like deciding what was gonna make the cut or not, I think came down to like I have these kinds of images. Which in these are the most interesting, like compositionally, light wise. It was just kind of technical decisions. Yeah. It was hard sometimes also because there were some images that were emotionally meaningful that I thought, whatever, I shouldn't have that. There were some images that were formally really interesting, but emotionally I had it was kind of like a constant negotiation. I had a lot of email threads to friends like Nathan called the Big Spaghetti Strainer. I don't know what it was called.
What?
Yeah, that was the title of the email, like Spaghetti Strainer, and I was like, which image? Like, so there was a lot of that, and then with a designer, I think it was just really helpful to have a Moroccan designer on board, also because of all the reasons of like self-examination I was discussing earlier. Of like, is this a scene that's really banal? Like, is this something I'm holding on to because of X, Y, Z? Reason that isn't justified? Is this repetitive? And then some of them also, I had more images when I started sequencing. Sometimes with the sequencing, especially the end of the book, sometimes it's like the images that I had trouble placing in were like, well, maybe it just doesn't have its place here. This certainly was one of them. It was hard to pair. I had a lot of images of people on beds. I had images of this room. I had images of my brother. Sometimes it was just like I had to delete them. Yeah, this is the first time my brother ever shaved. My dad is shaving him. And this is the room in which this is happening. I guess it was all a bit of that. It took a long time. Yeah. Also, I should say my publisher is Vue in Quebec City. They published the book. They're great, and the reason they published it is because I got this residency there that was to make a maquette of a book I was working on, and they had seen my initial maquette, and they were like, "You want to do the maquette?" And then a few weeks later, they were like, "Do you want us to publish your book?" And so when I went there, it was actually to work on not just a maquette, but like to work on the actual final product. And what I was able to do there was to print 500 images, which it seems like it's just expensive to do stuff, okay? And it was just great to be able to do that there for free. And they have these gigantic tables, and then I was just doing that for like 7 days. I was just putting all the images next to each other, like in a mosaic. I should have photos. I have photos of it. And then just being like, okay, what's the story? I know I want to start with this. I know that I want this not too close to the beginning. And then it's like Tetris. It's like, okay, this is with this. I know I want these together. I know I want this before that, but not on the same page. This makes me think of that. What's the story here? What's this? And then, that's how you sequence it. You actually need to have them on the table, I guess, and move them around. And you don't really look at spreads, but more as like, you read. Yeah. So, yeah. Yes.
I have a comment that will lead into a question, but so Fatine actually has done a music video. It's just not out yet.
It's true.
Which is
I'm not a music video director yet.
Right. But from so the music video is mine, and I just working.
Katie Lee.
Yeah, but working with you, then seeing. Actually, you talk about your book made me realize that I am curious. Well, I want to make a comment that Fatine, I feel like you experiment a lot with the medium, and I just remember doing so many scenes with you, but in the end, you only picked 2, and I think because you honor kind of the feeling, or you respect the subject or the person that you're working with,
And so even through all those like cool shots that we did and the experimentation you did, you picked the ones that you thought represented, the music and the work in an honest way. And so I'm curious, you say you want to make movies and, do more music videos, but, like I just wonder, how, and you can see in your photos how collaborative you are, and you talk about control and stuff, but you collaborate a lot with people. You say you're a controller, but, and so I'm just wondering kind of how you envision the work in terms of a moving picture in your next, artistic endeavor.
Yeah, I think the thing is that the collaborations I have are with people that are first and foremost friends. And so it's a part of our relationship. And I think if I think of making a movie, like with Nathan, like being in your movie is because it was part of our relationship. I think if I'm thinking of making a movie, I would do it with people who, this is going to sound terrible, but aren't necessarily making movies themselves as well. I think it would be about like doing it with people I trust for specific reasons. I think I wouldn't just start by making movies. I think I would start by making videos. I think it's going to be a process of unfolding that I wouldn't necessarily call like me heading towards my goal of making movies. But more like, okay, let's explore this thing we want to like play around in this form that could be a movie. Yes. Also, you said something that I forgot about. I wanted to address. It's not really answering your question though, but I think, and it also is also maybe answering your question, but I think a few years back, I had someone tell me that DJing is about holding back, which I understood as, which I kind of agree, because I think it's about like, and I think working with Shahan, because Shahan is a maximalist, and I'm always like, oh, we need to hold back. And I don't want to hold back. But I think that doing this work is learning to hold back. And I don't know. It's funny, yeah, that we shot all these scenes, and in the end, it's about just like these two shots, because I think if you hold back, you also can zoom in, and like subtlety emerges, and then you can throw the light on that, and that's where intimacy lives. Maybe, I don't know. Holy shit. Yeah.
I think that there could also be something to say about editing in the sense that like sometimes there is a division between your life and the work that you're doing, and that you have to let go of things that you think like that you have a relationship, but they don't necessarily like serve the book, for example. Or it's like where I'm working on the film, there's things that are like, I craft a scene in what we worked on, for example, that was like related to like this recipe that I had a cake with my dad. And it's just like, that's a nice idea for me, but it doesn't like work for the film. And I feel like a lot of my process with filmmaking, and maybe I can see that in your photo work as well, is just you have to let go of editing things, and that through the work you get closer to it in a certain sense.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question for you. Like these ideas that you have, for example, this reference to your dad via cake. Do you think that the ideas that you don't use because you need to cut them out, do you think that happens for a reason and you should it's like a sacred thing? Or do you think it's because you need to reuse them in the future? How do you feel about that? Are you superstitious about it?
Well, I feel like anything, like as far as things not being used means they're always on the table. But specifically with the cake thing, it was because it was such a small format, and this just pertains to the work, is that to have two, like, I mean, it's not gonna make a lot of sense without seeing it, but like to have a film of 15 minutes that has two scenes of like you eating a cake and then eating a hamburger, it was like too much of you eating, like that it would like, it would become you eating, and that wasn't the idea. So it's like, yes, this is like, I love my dad. I love that he has a cake recipe that is like special to me, but that's getting in the way of other things. And I think it's important to acknowledge that also.
Yeah, it's just thinking about these rejected photos also. It's like, yeah, I think what made the selection process easier is also to think like, you can make more books, you can make more things. These photos aren't going anywhere unless I lose my hard drive and all my negatives. But, you know, it's, yeah, that's why I'm asking about these kind of ideas for scenes. It's like, I guess, yeah, is it signs that you need to not use stuff? But that's a whole other, that's like more of an esoteric conversation, which we could have. But people are hungry. I am.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Check. Do the books have any text?
Oh yeah, my God. Yes, the books have a text. They have a foreword written by Joyce Juma here at the beginning. A big part of it explores my father's job, I think, which I discussed earlier. Friendship. Yeah, the title also. It was translated by A.M. Trépanier in French, edited by my mom. The book, I don't know what else to say. Yeah, I don't know. It was funny because I initially approached Joyce because I was like, oh, I wanted forward. I didn't know her that well, but we related because, you know, she's a filmmaker and an artist, and she's from Lebanon, and we just had like crossover, and I was like, who writes about your stuff? Like, how do you, I need someone to write. And she was like, I have people I can suggest you, but I'd love to do it. And I think a lot of things about this, I mean, speaking of superstition, a lot of things about this book also just like came in place because they seemed like they needed to be. And I just didn't want to like question some certain things with all these decisions I had to be making. And like, I just was trying to trust that certain things would emerge as signs. And that just felt like something I didn't want to touch that was happening. And so I said, yes, you can write it. That's it.
Unless there's any other questions, maybe it's a nice place to stop. But before we do, maybe you both could tell us what's coming up so we can follow along.
I'll start.
I'm storyboarding for a feature film that I will be shooting with my two brothers in 2025. And my clickbait, like buzz word for it right now is going to be a emo ambient Western. But if it doesn't turn out that way, it's not my fault.
How many minutes are we looking at?
I don't know. Feature. So I'm aiming for like 60 and beyond, but it's difficult to, I'm new to filmmaking also. So yeah, it's a little hard to say, but that is the idea.
Cool. I am working on a show in Pittsburgh at a gallery called Romance, mid to end July 2022. I am working on... what am I... I'm stuck in the past. I'm obsessed with my nostalgia. I am working on another show in September at Pumice in Montréal. And at some point next year, I think in January, maybe in February, solo at Eli Kerr in his new space in Montreal. Who knows? Yes. Oh, and... Sorry, this is a project that's just been dormant for so long, but I'm working on another comic, a collaboration, a comic made with Shahan Asadurian and Connor Williamson, who is a cartoonist and but it's a photo comic, and we want to release it every month. It's in the next month, so God knows, but it's gonna happen.
Thank you. Thank you both for doing this. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah, it went okay. Thanks so much, Nathan.
I want to say thanks to Fatine and to Parker, and just thanks for everyone for being here. It means so much.
Yeah, there's drinks outside the door. Feel free to hang out, look through the prints, look through the book. There's lots for sale. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
It's done. Oh my God. I feel like I talked way too much.
That's the whole point.